In this talk about Ezra Pound, I'm going to make reference to some of his poems, and one in particular I'm going to talk about in some detail, and that's the poem called Et femme salir le loup des bois. It's not all in French, just sounds like it is. And you might want to have a look at it before listening to the podcast. You can look at it in collections of Pound's verse, but also it was first published in a periodical I'm going to discuss called Blast, and it was in the second volume of that periodical. And you can see that on a wonderful site called the Modernist Journals Project, which has various journals from the early 20th century. It's very interesting in itself. So, why should we read the American modernist poet Ezra Pound? There are, I think, at least three reasons. First, he was the central figure in the early 20th century poetry movement. Living in London, Paris and Italy, but publishing right across the world, especially in the United States, he brought writers, publishers and patrons together. He, arguably more than any other single figure, really made modernism happen. Second, his career forces us to consider the role of poetry and of poets in the world. Should the poet comment on politics? Can poets be political figures? From the 1920s on, Pound firmly associated himself and his poetry with Benito Mussolini's fascist movement in Italy. In 1943, Pound was indicted for treason against the United States and deemed mentally unfit to stand trial. He was incarcerated in a hospital for the criminally insane until 1958. Third, Pound's poetry is some of the most innovative in the 20th century. It's important not only in its own right, but in laying the foundation for work by many subsequent poets. In this talk, I'm going to focus primarily on the third reason for reading Pound, but with the aim of showing how the innovations of his poetry can be divorced neither from his cultural politics nor his party politics. But even there, it's difficult to know where to begin with Pound, given the length and the diversity of his career. Should we begin with the cantos, that very long and famously elusive poem which he worked on for over 50 years? Or should we begin with the Imagist poems, which are short and lucid, they're much anthologized, but really they're part of his training rather than the mature work which set the parameters for subsequent avant-garde poetry. Today what I want to suggest is that we begin in the middle of these two phases of Pound's career and find a way out of Imagism and into the cantos by looking at an interim moment. And that interim moment I'm calling the moment of Blast. Now, in 1914 and 1915, Pound contributed to Blast, which was the short-lived journal of the Vorticist movement. The Vorticist movement was a group of poets, painters, sculptors, and it was led by the painter and novelist Percy Wyndham Lewis. Vorticism, influenced by the contemporaneous art movements on the continent, France and Italy especially, influenced by Cubism and Futurism, decided that it really wanted to shake up the artistic establishment in London. But looking back 36 years later, Lewis remarked that the inclusion of Pound's poetry and some of his literary contemporaries had been rather compromising. He thought that the literary figures were too bookish, they weren't as modern as the visual artists who appeared in the pages of Blast. And it's true that Pound's poems in Blast are not his best work. They haven't got the crystalline economy of the Imagist poetry, which had been published the year before in the British journal The New Free Woman and the American magazine Poetry. Nor have they got the intricacy and the complexity of the cantos, the first of which also appeared in the American Poetry magazine in 1917. And you can look at these journals on the Modernist Journals website as well. But the poems in Blast are all the more interesting, I think, because they are experiments. We can see here inside the poet's workshop. Now, the poem I'd like to talk about from Pound's contributions to Blast, as I mentioned at the beginning, is "Et femme se lire le loup des bois," and that's a quotation from one of Pound's poet heroes, François Villon, the Provençal poet, and it might be translated as "Because of hunger, wolves leave the woods." In the poem, Pound praises his vorticist colleagues, the painters Wyndham Lewis and Edward Wadsworth, and the sculptors Jacob Epstein and Henri Gaudier-Gerschke. But he complains that his praise of them has left him out in the cold, outside the London literary scene, because the literati, the people who are controlling what goes on in the British cultural scene, don't agree with his taste. He complains that to be part of that scene, he has to capitulate to so-called civilization by not criticising the establishment journals, magazines and newspapers. The trigger for this poem had occurred the previous October. George Prothero, who was the editor of the Quarterly Review, a very well-respected and establishment journal that Pound had been cultivating since June 1912. Prothero had rejected Pound's proposals for further contributions because he didn't approve of Pound being associated with this group around Blast. But the fact that Pound published his frustration in a poem rather than writing about it in a letter is important and very interesting, because although the content of this poem is clearly very specifically autobiographical, the form of the poem might be read as a submerged critique of Pound's earlier poetry written under the aegis of Imagism, the poetic movement that Pound had founded with his friends H.D., the poet Hilda Doolittle, and Richard Aldington in 1913. The poem begins by using the metaphor of a shipwreck. Pound represents himself as at sea, clinging onto a bit of a wrecked boat with waves of icy water breaking over him. This beginning, the first-person perspective, the isolation, the use of wave imagery, all this recalls Imagist poetry. But in the third line of the poem, there's a dash which breaks the poem before it performs a move which Imagist poetry very rarely does. This poem makes its metaphor explicit. Pound tells us that the waves are civilization, the superficial civilization of the literary establishment. The poem seems not to trust us to interpret the metaphor ourselves, and indeed it abandons it entirely after the first 4 lines. For this poem has something to say. It has an opinion, and that opinion, it seems, cannot be encapsulated in an image. Pound thus puts aside the first 2 self-imposed rules of Imagism as they'd been advertised in the poetry magazine in 1913, where he wrote that you should always deal directly with the subject of your poem and that you shouldn't use any extraneous words or any ornament, you shouldn't talk round, you shouldn't explain. The conversational tone in this poem involves a certain looseness of expression, in fact. There are a series of repetitions of the phrase "say that" you'll see if you look at the poem. But Pound arguably adheres to the third Imagist rule that he advertised in 1913, and that was that one should try to not to make one's verse regular or follow a traditional rhythmic form, but rather that one should let the verse dictate the music of the line. Now, this is, of course, mainly a point about the Imagist preference for free verse over regular metres, but it's also an insistence that the poet pays attention to the sound of what he or she writes. Pound is very justly renowned for his poetic ear, and in this period he's really putting it to the test. He's working out how far he can stretch the poetic line, finding out just what he can get into poetry. In Et femme se lire le loup des bois, he's straining the poem's rhythm, particularly in the middle of the poem, where his voice lists through a whole pile of clauses. The poem itself resolves very calmly, if rather kind of self-indulgently, in the final line, very confidently slowed down with a caesura. So this poem is one of a number from the period that keeps the contemporary diction of Pound's early Imagist poetry, but it opens up the form of the poem to try out a social critique of a sharper kind than Pound had previously attempted. It's the beginning of an opening up that would result in what we call, or what we think of as the open text of the cantos, a poem whose form would become so capacious that Pound was able to incorporate in it sections of the Odyssey, of Thomas Jefferson's letters, John Adams's diaries, a French history of China, the sayings of Confucius, and bring all of this together into a critique of modern civilization. Et femme se lire le Luc des Bois then shows us the limits of Imagist poetry, and if you look at the paradigmatic Imagist poem in a station of the metro, you can see not only its very often praised achievement in transferring the lessons of the Japanese haiku to a modern English diction, but also you can see just what Imagism couldn't do. Now, Pound described his poem in a station of the metro as an attempt to turn a wonderful experience he had when he came out of the Paris metro, attempt to turn that experience into a poem. He said that on getting out of the train, he'd become immersed in the crowd and then seen beautiful face after beautiful face rising up in front of him. He said that he'd spent a long time trying to work out how to convert this experience into a poem. But it was only when he thought about how Japanese haiku worked that he realised how his poem might be composed. The point of telling you that is really to emphasise that Imagism is all about capturing an experience. It's primarily a formal response to its immediate literary history. And in many ways, it's a distilling of ideas about poetry in 1913 that had actually been prevalent since the 1890s. The Cantos, however, is a poem that aimed to respond to the major social and political issues of its time, not by capturing a moment, capturing an experience, but actually by analysing history. The Cantos had its genesis in the Great War, and Et femme se lire le Luc des Bois was published in Blast's War Number. The second volume was called The War Number, and it was its second and last issue. Pound's poem about aesthetic freedom might seem remarkably disengaged from its wartime context. In fact, if you read Pound's essays from this period, you see that they're actually intimately connected. In a wartime essay about his very close friend James Joyce, Pound wrote about how important it was that there was well-written literature produced during the war, because he thought that it was a way that nations learnt about each other and learnt to be sympathetic to each other. So if we wanted to create a peaceful world, especially a peaceful Europe, he was thinking in this period, then it was very important that people could read about the characters of different nations realistically. And it's with that in mind that I encourage you to read the Cantos, which Pound began working on seriously in 1915 during the war, and he started publishing from 1917 in the same journal in which he'd published his Imagist poetry, the American Poetry magazine. And if you look at the first of the three cantos that he published there in 1917, and most of which were discarded, you'll see that Pound had to develop a very different kind of poetry to suit his new purposes. To write a poem that can get historical cause and effect into poetry. He creates a remarkably variegated text which expands our very definition of what a poem can hold. I'm not going to try and summarise or explain the cantos here, but I would say that there's no getting around the fact that the Cantos is a poem that invites study and thought. There's much of the poem that doesn't offer up its sense on a first reading or in brief extracts. But I also think that we should ask, why should it? Not all poems have to be lyric poems, and not all poems have to be Imagist poems.